Well, Christians, the Muslims are coming for your faith, and they have the facts to prove that Christianity is wrong. I just thought that was a good tagline to open it up. Hi, I'm Josh Barnes. This is a show where we're unashamed to look at political, social, cultural, and theological issues, if I can spit it all out without stumbling over myself. All from a biblical world. I can't spit it all out without stumbling over myself. All right, let's start again. I'm Pastor Josh Barnes. This is Point of View. Is the show where we're unashamed to look at political, social, cultural, and theological issues from a biblical worldview. We do that because Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. And that's actually provable. We've done that in other episodes. I can't prove it in every single episode, but you can go back and watch them if you want to. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, and we can prove that, then everything else is true. The Bible is true because Jesus said so, and he proved that he knew what he was talking about. And this is the position that we operate on here at the show. And we want to look at all these issues from a biblical worldview, because if the Bible's true and we can prove that it is, then we can't be right about issues if we disagree with the Bible. But here's the question: is the Bible true? Isn't there evidence? Isn't there contradictions in the Bible? And I've got today two videos that I want to talk about from Muslims, people who are believers in Islam, who think that they, who are on TikTok and these types of things, and they believe that they can disprove the Bible, which is interesting because the official Muslim position is that the Bible is true. That's actually, I'm not sure if you knew that. This is actually in the Quran, that the Bible is actually true and good and a helpful book. But these guys are trying to say the Bible's not true, which is a strange thing from a Muslim who believes the Quran, that says the Bible is true. It's just a bit of a paradox. But anyway, here we go. Here's our first video. Here we go.
You want to know one of the biggest contradictions in the Bible? You see, the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most important events in Christianity, and you would think that supposedly his disciples would have been present and they would have heard and seen the same thing. But it's quite shocking that none of the Gospels can agree on what Jesus' last words were. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' last words were, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit," and then he died. However, in the Gospel of John, his last words were simply, "It is finished," and then he died. But wait, it gets even worse. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that Jesus' last words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is not only a contradiction, but it implies that Jesus abandoned his faith in his last moments. Imagine the final words of who they see as God, and yet they couldn't get that right. So imagine what other details they must have completely messed up.
Okay, so this guy's name is, I should have given this to you before, Akber, akber.io. That's his TikTok name, tiktok.com/@akber.io. And he, on his TikTok, it's invite all to the way of the Lord with wisdom and kind advice. He seems to be a Muslim or from Islam, but at least that's what I could tell from just this cursory look at it. But he seems to not know that, the book of Islam, the book of the Quran actually talks about the truth of Jesus and what Jesus says. So in, Surah 5:46, it says, "And we sent Jesus, the son of Mary, after those prophets confirming the truth of whatever there still remained of the Torah." Surah 5:67 and 5:71 also says similar things. So basically, like, it's odd that a Muslim would try to discredit the reality of Jesus because because Jesus, like the teachings of Jesus are supposedly, though they don't believe he's God, they do believe he was a prophet, and all the stuff contained in the Gospels is true, unless I'm missing something, or there's something about all of these things that I'm uncertain of. There's maybe different sects of Islam that reject the Quran, but it seems like if the Quran says that what Jesus said is true, as is written in the Gospels, then why are you questioning the Gospels if you're a Muslim? I suppose there's more to that. Different sects of Muslims might have different arguments about that, but it doesn't make sense if you believe the Quran. However, let's actually address this question. Is there contradictions in the Bible? Let's see. I'm going to pull it back up here and allow us to go through it piece by piece. So
You want
let's
to know one of the
start again.
biggest contradictions in the Bible?
The biggest contradiction in the Bible. Here we go. Muslims are going to tell us, Christians, what the biggest contradiction in the Bible.
You see, the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most important events in Christianity, and you would think that supposedly his disciples would have been present and they would have heard and seen the same thing.
Okay, all right, let's stop right there. Okay, this is the biggest contradiction in the Bible. And he starts out by introducing it by saying, you would think that if this is the most important thing for Christians, that his disciples would have been there and they would have seen. No. The only disciple who was there at the cross was John. Like, have you read? I'm wondering, Akbar, if you've read the Bible, because according to the Bible, all of the disciples except 3 fled in the Garden of Gethsemane. The 3 who didn't run away when Jesus was taken to go on trial were John, Peter, and Judas. Of course, Judas was the one who betrayed him. That's why he didn't run away. He eventually went and hanged himself later. Peter left so that he wouldn't be seen with Jesus, but followed from a distance. And then John actually stayed with Jesus and stayed with him. So later, Peter denied Jesus and ran away during the trial. And so the only one, by the time Jesus was put to death, the only one at the cross as far as his 12 disciples was John. Now, there were other women at the cross. There were other people at the cross who passed the story along, and that's how it was recorded. So we have every reason to think the recording is accurate, because these when Mark and Matthew write it down, they actually list their sources. They tell you who was at the cross so that you know where they're getting the information from. You can ask them if this information is true, right? That's why that's why they were writing it down. Mark especially was writing to people who didn't believe in Jesus to tell them the story of Jesus so that they would believe. So he was giving them names of people who were there so they could check and see if that's true. So all that to say, your opening statement there, Akbar, isn't starting off so good, because you're saying this is the biggest contradiction in the Bible, but you obviously don't know the Bible. You think that all the apostles were there when Jesus was crucified, and they weren't. Only one of them was.
But it's quite shocking that none of the Gospels can agree on what Jesus' last words were.
Okay, so do they disagree on what Jesus' last words were? He goes first to Luke 23:46.
According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' last words were, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit."
Okay, according to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' last words. Does Luke, I'm going to pull it up here right now, Luke 23, and what verse is he saying? 46. All right. Does it say that his last words were, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit"? Let's see. Luke 23:46. Let's start at verse 45. And the sun was darkened, the veil of the temple was rent in the midst, and when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And having thus said, he gave up the ghost. Okay, it doesn't say this is his last thing. It just says, having thus said, meaning once he had said this, he died. It doesn't mean that he couldn't have said anything else in between that. But, you get the impression it's the last thing recorded in Luke. But Luke doesn't actually say it's his last words. I actually do think that it's a very good chance that this was the last thing he said, "Into thy hand I commend my spirit." That would make sense, right? Let's let him continue.
And then he died. However, in the Gospel of John, his last words were simply, "It is finished," and then he died.
Okay, does John say that "it is finished" is his last words? Let's go there. John 19 and verse 20, right? Is that what he's got up there on the screen? Yeah, John 19, verse 30, actually. Okay. Let's see. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Does that say that that was the last thing he said? That he couldn't have said anything else? He couldn't have said, "It is finished," and then, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit"? John was focusing on one thing that Jesus said and wrote it down, and someone else wrote down something else that he said. They couldn't possibly, they both said, "This is the last thing he said." No, neither of these gospel writers said, this is the last thing he said. John is focusing on certain things and wrote down certain things, and someone else, and Luke wrote down something else. Neither of them said it was the last thing he said, although what Luke says does appear to be the last thing. It says, I commend my spirit into thy hands. Like that seems to like the last thing. It is finished is certainly something near the end. But it just says, he said, it is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. It doesn't say he immediately bowed his head and gave up the ghost without saying anything else. Certainly it doesn't say that. There's not a contradiction there. Okay, well, let's let him continue because he says it gets worse. Oh, let's see.
But wait, it gets even worse. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that Jesus' last words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Okay, Mark 15:34. Surely, in Mark, it will actually say these are his last words. Because in the other Gospels so far, it hasn't actually said that. Mark 15, verse 34. Let's go there and see. Let's see. It says, and at the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of them that stood by it when they heard it said, Behold, he calleth Elias. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar and put it on a reed, gave him to drink, saying, Let alone, let us see whether Elias will come to take him down. Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. It actually says that he said something else. Mark actually says, after he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Someone went and got vinegar, put it on a reed, gave it to him. John actually tells us after he received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. That maybe is the thing he cried very loudly. Like that would make sense because Mark says after that, he cried with a loud voice. Mark just didn't tell us what he said. But Mark said that he said something else. Mark, like, it's a stretching. This is so bad, Akbar. I want to say to Akbar, just me and you, man to man, this is really bad. Do you not see how bad of an argument it is that you're presenting here? I really, really hope and pray that you see that this is just not a contradiction at all. None of these passages that you've presented actually say that these things are the last things, the very last thing he said. It just doesn't record the other things that he said. That's okay. When you're getting an account from three different people, you expect them not to be all exactly the same. If they're all exactly the same, you know it's a rehearsed, planned out account. If they're all a little different, you know that each person was seeing different things. Mark had different sources than Luke did for who were there at the cross. So he was writing down the things that his sources remembered, and Luke was writing down the things that his sources remembered. John was actually there, and he's writing down the things that he remembers. Okay? If they were all exactly the same, you'd be able to point at it and say, no, this isn't true. They obviously rehearsed this and came up with this. They concocted this story. The fact that they're all remembering different aspects of it is part of how we know that this is actually true. It wasn't a made-up story, right? So this is actually really, really good evidence for the truth of the Bible, especially since it doesn't contradict. It doesn't say that any of these phrases were his last statement, the last thing he said, although Luke's does imply that more. It does imply when he says, into thy hands I commend my spirit, and having thus said, he gave up the ghost. Almost like this is when he gave up the ghost. He died. Where the other ones don't say that, right? John says, he said it is finished, and he bowed his head and died. It doesn't say that he didn't say anything else. And Mark says specifically that he said something else. Now, what about this next accusation that he's going to bring? That actually, let me just hit play and let him bring the accusation. I'll respond to it.
Which is not only a contradiction, but it implies that Jesus abandoned his faith in his last moments.
All right, him saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It implies that Jesus abandoned his faith at his last moments. Do you realize he's at one point saying that the writers of the Gospels made it up and weren't telling the truth. And at another point, and now he's saying that the writers of the Gospels believed that Jesus abandoned his faith and actually admitted it in their made-up story about Jesus. They made up a story where Jesus abandoned his faith? Like, if it's true that this is Jesus abandoning his faith, this would be the last thing that Mark would include in a gospel writing trying to convince people of Jesus if it meant that he was abandoning his faith and Mark was just making it up. Right? So that doesn't make any sense. That's a completely nonsense, Akbar. No sense at all. Nonsense. Besides the fact that it didn't mean that Jesus was abandoning his faith. It doesn't imply, God, you forsook me. I don't believe in you anymore. No. He said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? What does he mean by forsaken? That's really the question. What does he mean by forsaken? Well, he was quoting, he said, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means that he was actually quoting the Old Testament. He was using the Old Testament language to quote from a psalm in the Old Testament. It's Psalm 20. So let me read to you Psalm 20. I'm sorry, not Psalm 20, Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? David writes. Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? I cry, oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not. In the nighttime, in the night season, I am not silent. What is he saying? He's saying, God, you've forsaken me. And then he explains what he means by by forsaking. He says, David is writing, and he says, you're not helping me when I need help. Jesus is claiming the words of David. By the way, the rest of the Psalm 22, describes crucifixion in a way David could not possibly have known, because crucifixion didn't exist when David was writing it. David was prophesying of a crucifixion of the Messiah. We could actually go into that, but we just don't have the time. At the end of it even says, at the end of the Psalm, it even says that as a result of this person being crucified, verse 28 of Psalm 22, for the kingdom is the Lord's, and he is the governor among the nations. All they shall be fat upon the earth shall eat and worship, and they shall go down to the dust and bow before him, and none can keep alive his own soul. A seed shall serve him. It shall be accounted to the Lord for a generation. They shall come and shall declare his righteousness unto a people that shall be born. So he's saying, in the future, because of this crucifixion, that David didn't understand was crucifixion. He didn't know what crucifixion was, but he describes crucifixion in Psalm 22, and then says at the end, because of this, people are going to come, Christ is going to set up his kingdom, and people are going to come and worship him, because people from all nations are going to come and worship him because of this event that is crucifixion, that David didn't understand was crucifixion, but he described the crucifixion. So it's clearly talking about the Messiah. Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy of the Messiah dying on the cross. And so Jesus refers to this psalm saying, hey, remember this was written about when he to all the people sitting around. Hey, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He's actually quoting the scripture that's talking about him, prophesying that he would die on the cross. And he's specifically saying, as David did in the psalm, that God has not helped him. The Father has not come to rescue him. He's far from helping me. Like in verse 1, it says, why art thou so far from helping me? Like Jesus, the Son of God, was not helped by God on the cross. And Jesus is calling attention to this, to the people around him. He's saying, my God, why have you not helped me? Why have you forsaken me? It's almost like a question to everyone around. Like, have you thought about the fact that God isn't helping me? I was able to heal everyone else. I could do whatever I could perform miracles. I raised Lazarus from the dead, and yet God is not helping me now. Why? Why has God forsaken me? The question seems obvious, that this was part of the plan. That's the reason God had forsaken him. Jesus is calling to the people's attention that this was all part of the plan. Jesus is doing the exact opposite of saying, I lost my faith. He's quoting scripture and saying this was part of the plan. As a matter of fact, the book of Mark has been laying out a case throughout the book of Mark. It keeps saying that Jesus said, hey, I'm going to Jerusalem and there I'm going to die. I'm going to Jerusalem, there I'm going to die. Several times throughout the book of Mark, Jesus has predicted his own death. He's not now shocked that he's dying and saying, I've lost my faith in Jesus. At least not if Mark is making up the story, it's an incoherent story. Mark has already made up that Jesus has predicted his death. No. This is not what it's saying. It's not implying that Jesus lost his faith. Rather, it's saying the exact opposite. That this was all part of the plan. And he's calling attention to that fact. So, fail. Fail on that account. I don't know if I have time for this one. All right, we're going to try to squeeze this in. Here's another, I believe it's Muslim. It's at One True Message Foundation on TikTok. One True Message Foundation. They are going to try to disprove the Bible. We're going to deal with this one pretty quickly because it's actually really simple, even though it sounds really complicated.
God can't make mistakes.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, for sure, yeah.
So the Bible should have no mistakes in it.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I agree, yeah.
And if there were mistakes in the Bible, would you have a problem with that?
I would definitely question myself.
Let me show you one, okay? Just so you can, So this is 2 Kings, okay? He's talking about Ahaziah, okay? The 2 Kings 8:26. He was 22 years old when Ahaziah began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. How old was he?
22.
22. Yeah?
20 years old, yeah.
And who are we talking about?
Isaiah.
I believe God can't make mistakes.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, for sure, yeah.
So the Bible should have no mistakes in it.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I agree, yeah.
And if there were mistakes in the Bible, would you have a problem with that?
I would definitely question myself.
Let me show you one, okay? Just so you can see. And this is clear cut, okay? So this is 2 Kings, okay? He's talking about Ahaziah, okay? The 2 Kings 8:26. He was 22 years old when Ahaziah began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. How old was he?
22.
22. Yeah?
20 years old, yeah.
And who are we talking about?
Isaiah.
Okay. Now, if the same Isaiah in Second Chronicles was 42 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned a year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, daughter of Omri. If you can address this one point for me.
Quick, please.
So, why is God making a mistake here?
What mistake?
How old is Isaiah when he began to reign? Was he 22 or 42?
22 years old, right?
He's 22 or 42. Which one is it?
But how is that a mistake though? I don't get it. Like, how is that
How old are you?
21.
Okay. Are you 21 or 41?
21.
21. You can't be both.
Yeah.
So why has Isaiah got two ages here?
I have no idea.
Boom. They got him, guys. Like, they got him. Like, they undisputable evidence that the Bible is false. It's just because in Kings it says that Ahaziah became king when he was 22, but in Chronicles it says that he became king when he was 42. So there's a mistake in the Bible. That means the Bible's not all true. Oh no. Guys, this is just really bad. This is now I know it appears frustrating at first, but just remember, guys, we don't have to have answers to everything that comes up, right? We don't have to. We don't have to have all of the answers to every possible thing that people are going to come up with to know that it's true. The Bible is true, and we've already proven that. Because we can prove that Jesus rose from the dead, because we can prove that prophecy was really fulfilled. We can prove so many other things. We know that this is true, right? So it shouldn't really bother us if there's something we just don't have the answer to. And I think that's all this issue is. We just don't have the, or this person they're talking to, they're hoping that the people they're talking to don't have the answer. And that if they don't have the answer, they're going to assume that it is necessarily means that the Bible is false. Like, you have to answer every question. And if you don't personally come up with an answer to every question, then the Bible's false. Well, no. Me not knowing the answer doesn't mean that there isn't an answer. So don't get too worried about these kind of things. Sometimes I think Christians get really worried, like nervous. It's actually not that hard, because if you look at any other translation of the Bible besides the King James translation, you're going to find that it doesn't say 42. It says 22 in 2 Chronicles. Let me show you what 2 Chronicles says. Okay, 2 Chronicles chapter 22. Chapter 22, verse 1, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah his son king in his stead, for the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had slain all the eldest. So Ahaziah the son of Joram, king of Judah, reigned. And then in the King James it says 42 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign. Okay, that's what the King James says. All right. Now, let me go back one chapter to 2 Chronicles chapter 21. All right. Actually, it's not even a chapter. It's 2 verses. It talks about Ahaziah's father's death. It says, it came to pass the time at the end of 2 years, his bowels fell out by reason of his sickness, so he died of sore disease. And his people made no burning for him like the burning of his fathers. 32 years old was he when he began to reign. Okay, get this. Ahaziah's father was 32 when he started to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years and departed without being desired. So his father started reigning at 32, died 8 years later at 40. This is the one verse before we read about Ahaziah becoming king, and in the second verse, 2 verses after, it's saying that his father was 40 when his father died. Ahaziah took his father's place as the next king, and in 2 Chronicles 22:2, it says 42 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign. Well, his dad was 40 when he died, which means Ahaziah could not have been 40, let alone 42, right? Because you got to be younger than your dad, right? I mean, you got to be at least, like, let's use extreme scenarios. Ahaziah could not have possibly been more than about 25 or 6, maybe. I mean, depends on how young his father was when he had him, but I mean, he definitely couldn't have been 30. If his dad died at 40, he couldn't have been 30 when his dad died, right? I mean, right? Am I missing something? The book tells us very clearly, 2 verses before, that his dad was 40 when he died, and immediately after his dad died, he became king. So we have 2 options here. Either when it says 42 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign, it's either saying, this is probably not accurate, but it's clearly not saying that Ahaziah was 42 when his dad was 40. Like, that doesn't make any sense. That's clearly not what the text is saying. Like, that's very obviously not the case. So we obviously are misunderstanding it. There's 2 options. Either one, it's talking about the dynasty of Ahaziah, meaning his dad, so on and so forth. And the immediate dynasty was now 42 years old when Ahaziah began to reign. 42 years old was Ahaziah's dynasty when he began to reign. That's a stretch, but it's one possible interpretation. It fits a whole lot better than in 2 verses, a guy writing, hey, Ahaziah's dad was 40 when he died, and Ahaziah became the next king when he was 42. That doesn't make any sense, right? That definitely is not what the scripture is saying. It's more likely that it would be a dynasty, but I think it's even more likely that it's actually meant to be 22. Like, interestingly enough, if you look at what we translate the Old Testament from, is from the Masoretic texts, the Hebrew Masoretic texts that were actually put together in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. If you look at the Septuagint, which was a translation of the older Hebrew texts from before the 1st century, the Septuagint actually translates it at 22. So it's probably just when the Masoretics were writing it out, there was a scribal error, there was a mistake as they were writing it, as they were copying it. And that's why all the other translations look at all the copies and say, no, obviously originally it said 22, right? And so it was an error in copying. It wasn't an error in the original manuscripts. It's obvious that it meant 22. There's no question at all. And so this isn't an error in scripture. It's just error in a translation. It's just an error in one translation, and those things happen. So guys, don't throw out your faith. Honestly, just don't just dump your faith when you see things. Just know you don't have to have all the answers to know there is an answer, and to trust God with all of the abundance of evidence you already have to continue believing that the Bible is true. And certainly don't let Muslims convince you otherwise. We'll see you next time, right here on Point of View.